If you ever wondered what Tommy Paul and Jim Courier have in common, it's not their good looks. It's Brad Stine. Hello, ground passers, and welcome back to Meet the Professionals. Today, we're sitting down with one of the most fascinating coaching minds in tennis, Brad Stine. He coached Jim Courier during that early 90s prime and has been in Tommy Paul's corner as Tommy has grown into one of the most dangerous players in the game right now. Brad's career is basically a front row seat to how tennis has evolved. The training, the travel, the pressure, the expectations, and what it actually takes to guide a player through all of it then and now. In this conversation, we get into Brad's path through the sport, what great coaching looks like behind the scenes, and why tennis coaches don't get the same household name recognition as coaches in leagues like the NBA or NFL, even though their influence can just be as massive. So grab a coffee, get comfortable, and let's get into it. Hello, everyone. Welcome, ground passers, to another episode of Meet the Professionals. We have the lovely Brad Stine here to talk to us about all things coaching. We've been promising this episode for a while, Nick. We've been promising a full deep dive into coaching for so long, and I don't think we could have gotten anyone better to talk to about this.
No, definitely not.
Am I turning red?
A little bit.
I
Just a little
thought
bit.
maybe you were like showing the beard that you've grown with your wisdom.
That was such a nice intro, Anastasia. Honestly, I appreciate that.
No, it's really great to have you on. You've had such a great sort of history and story with tennis, but with Meet the Professionals episodes, we start always the same way, and we'll start the same way with you. What was your earliest memory of what you wanted to do when you grew up?
Wow. Earliest memory. I mean, when I was a little kid, I'm pretty sure that I probably said I wanted to be a fireman. Like for my generation, that's kind of what everybody said when they were a kid. You wanted to be a fireman. And to be honest, I would guess, like, I don't know that it was a clear memory when I was a kid, but I was a baseball player when I was a kid. I didn't start playing tennis till I was a bit later. So I probably aspired to want to be a pro baseball player. It's funny that it's a great question because I can tell you the moment that I actually verbalized for the first time ever in my life that I was going to be a coach, a tennis coach. I was on a conversation with Greg Patton. I don't know if you guys know Greg Patton or not, but he was a legend and is a legend in the collegiate tennis area, two-time NCAA Coach of the Year, and a great mentor to me, was the best man in my wedding. And Greg is really the person that I credit for me being where I'm at and having had the career that I've had, because he contacted me about becoming involved with and coaching the USTA junior national team, which back in the 80s we called the Junior Davis Cup team. And we had two conversations on the phone. And on the first one, I actually said, no, I wasn't going to do it. I was 26 years old. I was still playing a little bit. I was playing kind of semi-pro-ish type tennis. I was traveling every summer for 3 or 4 months and going to France and playing these money tournaments in France and really having a good time, loving the tennis, but also loving just the experience of being in a different culture and all that. And I had already bought a ticket that year to go and play, and I was kind of feeling it was going to be my last summer, and then I was going to try and get a little bit serious about whatever it was I was going to do, which honestly at that time I didn't know. I really didn't know what I was going to do. And then Greg called me again the next day, and we had a long conversation, and he basically talked me into it. And at some point in that conversation, he asked me, well, what do you want to do? What do you see yourself doing 10 years from now? And I said, I think I probably want to be a coach. And I think that's the first time that I ever, in my head, literally, I know it's the first time I verbalized it. And so, it had probably been there for quite a while.
Yeah.
I was helping as the assistant coach at Fresno State, where I had played at that time, so I was already kind of in the coaching realm. And as I often say, I'm not sure I was smart enough to do much of anything else. Coaching was a good path for me from that standpoint. But that's the first time I know that I really said it. So I would say that's the first time. I was 25 and a half or 26 years old when that happened.
That's really interesting, Brad. So I guess what was it that kind of drew you to that? Because it sounds like that was something you hadn't really thought about, but something that you knew that you wanted to do. And I guess when you started, what did coaching look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, When I initially started coaching, I mean, my coaching experience actually began in that summer of that year after I accepted that position with Coach Patton. So I was super lucky. He's a great coach. He's an unbelievable motivator. He still does speaking engagements as a motivational speaker. That team that I was exposed to, right, the very first time that I was really involved with coaching, here I am coaching the best players in the United States on our Junior Davis Cup team, which in that year was the first year we started a 16 and under team. Previously, it was always just 18 and unders. And we had Pete Sampras, Michael Chang, Jim Courier, Jeff Tarango, Jared Palmer, basically every guy, Todd Martin, Malavia, Washington, every guy that became a top 100 player in that generation, except for Andre. Andre was already kind of like ahead of everybody and was almost turning pro at that point, and the rest of the guys were. So that was really my first exposure. And then at the same time, just crazy, fortuitous, situation. In the middle of that summer, the guy that was the head coach at Fresno State, who I'd been coaching with for a couple of years as an assistant, stepped down. After a 16-year career, he was a full professor at the school. He wanted to spend more time with his family. And so he contacted me and he said, hey, I'm stepping down. I'm going to push really hard for you to get the head coaching job. Do you want it? And I was like, absolutely, I want that job. So in that same summer, I got the head coaching job at Fresno State. And at that time I was 26, and I was actually the youngest Division I head coach in the country in college tennis then.
Wow. So you're so young, you get into coaching the Junior Davis team. How do you transition then to coaching on the Pro ATP Tour? Like, what was that sort of transition there?
Yeah, you know what? It was that job. It was the Junior Davis Cup position, because that gave me an in and exposed me to all those guys. And so I knew all those guys. I did that job. That was a summer position back then with the USTA. Here in the States, we didn't have a national training center back then. And the Junior Davis Cup program was a summer program where the kids were taken under the wing of the USTA. All their expenses were paid. And it culminated at the US Open. That was the big finish, but they played a full junior schedule here within the US. And so having that position created an awareness from those players, and for me, of those players. And then we were lucky. So many lucky things I feel like happened in my career. But there was an exhibition event that was held here in Fresno, California, where I live, at a really nice club. They have a super nice sunken center court, and it was called the Young American Challenge, and it was put on annually here in town. It had TV coverage, and it was an 8-player event, and they hosted it at this club, and there was one year where it was Courier, Chang, Andre was there, and I had already known Jim. That was after Jim had turned pro, and he had just been on the tour for maybe, I'm not even sure if he'd been on the tour for a full year at that point. But, I knew him, and I knew the other guys from Junior Davis Cup. So this is a few years down the line, and I went out, saw Jim, contacted him before he got here, chatting a little bit. We went out to dinner one night. We went to a jazz show here in town one night, and just talking about a lot of stuff. And he was telling me how he was struggling with a few different things, and I gave him a couple of strategies that I thought would help him. And he goes to this tournament like 2 weeks after he was here for that event, and he did really well. Can't remember, he made quarters or semis, had a couple of really good wins, and messaged me and was like, hey, thanks for the input. It really helped. I really applied that stuff, And then down the road, he's looking to make a change in coaching. And at the time, one of my really, really close friends to this day, Tom Gullickson, was in charge of our men's program back then. And Jim contacted Tom. He wanted to work with Jose Higueras. Jose wasn't really very interested at that time in traveling. He was working with some few different players kind of on a part-time basis with the USTA, mostly American players. And my name was on a short list that Jim came up with Tom Gullickson of people that he would potentially be interested in traveling with. And so Tom called me and said, hey, Courier's looking for a guy to be on the road with him. Would you be interested in doing it? And I jumped at the chance because 2 years earlier, Pete Fisher, the guy who's credited for developing Pete Sampras, called me and asked me if I would be interested in traveling with Pete. And being the genius that I am, I turned him down. So at that time, 2 years earlier, Pete had literally qualified for like one tournament. And I don't know, his ranking was like in the 300s or something like that. And I had, I was the head coach at Fresno State, and I'd kind of gotten bumped up a little bit in the hierarchy of the USTA. And I felt like it was just too much risk to go on the road with this one young, Pete was like 16 and a half, 17 years old at the time, maybe younger. And so, I turned him down. And then I sat in my office at Fresno State for 2 years watching Pete's progress and was like, God, what an idiot. So when Jim came along and presented the option to go on tour, I jumped at it. And also Jim, when I started with Courier, Jim was ranked 28 in the world. So it was a much different.
Right. So, so that's your start in the world of coaching. But I think in today's age, most people who know you as the coach of Tommy Paul. And we want to sort of get into the world of coaching as it is now, comparing it to what it was before, and then also looking forward. So the first thing I want to ask you is, what is the biggest difference between, for example, you coaching Jim Courier and you currently now coaching Tommy Paul? What do you think the biggest difference is?
It's funny. You know what the first thing that popped into my head was?
What?
Now we have a designated coaching area with good seats. Back in the 90s.
Where were you before?
No, I'm serious. Back in the 90s when I was coaching Courier, we just would like find seats to sit in. We didn't have like designated areas except for at like the slams, and everywhere else it was like literally just like find a seat in the stands where you can get as close to the courts as you can. And so it was kind of like you were just floating around, and not very many guys in the 90s. And I would say this is another big change. It's not specifically about coaching, but it is about like the whole experience. There just weren't very many big teams. It was like, when I coached Courier, and I coached Courier on and off, I call it Courier 1 and Courier 2 because we had a little break in the middle. But we were together for almost 8 years, and we traveled, probably 90% of the time or more was just the two of us. Jose came to 3 of the slams. He never came to Australia. He came to the French, Wimbledon, and the U.S. Open. He went to Indian Wells because he lives in Palm Springs, and he went to Indianapolis because he always had his own deal with Indianapolis. And then he went to the ATP finals. I never went to the ATP finals with Jim. So I would take that time off, and he would take the Australian off. And so otherwise it was just me and Jim. It was just me and Jim that were traveling, and Jim used the ATP physios, and he didn't have a strength and conditioning coach that traveled with us. Like out of those 8 years, his strength and conditioning coach probably came 2 or 3 times at the most. So now, I like having a small team. We're still with Tommy, a relatively small team, the vast majority of the time. It's generally Tommy, myself, and Sebastian Kozarin, our physio. And then now and then Franco, Tommy's strength and conditioning coach, will come. But the majority of the time it's the 3 of us. When you look around at a lot of the other players, you have teams of 4, 5, 6 guys sometimes that are on the tour, whether it's a parent or they have a psychologist now that's coming to, especially to the bigger tournaments, not every week, single week, every week in and out. But a lot of the players are traveling with, almost an entourage to the bigger events, especially to the slams and to like the bigger Masters 1000s. They're all the same, but, some of them are considered a little bigger than others. So I think that's an enormous change. I think from the standpoint of coaching itself and being on court and spending time with your player and trying to talk to your players about doing this or doing that to try and progress their game, I don't think that part has necessarily changed an enormous amount. The court dimensions are the same. The balls are relatively the same. There's a lot of discussion about the balls all the time, but the balls are relatively the same. Obviously, the biggest change in tennis, and we have to deal with that from a coaching standpoint and then with our players, is the racket and string changes, the equipment changes from that standpoint. The game has changed. There's no doubt about that from when I started coaching back in the 90s or in the 80s. The game has changed to where we're at now and how the game is played and how you see and perceive the game. And I was just talking yesterday, I had lunch with my former assistant coach when I played college tennis yesterday, and we were talking about a lot of this. And one of the things I was saying to him was that one of the nicer compliments I've gotten over the last, I don't know, 6 or 8 or 10 years was a friend of mine, someone that I know that I respect a lot in tennis, said to me that one of the things they've always been so impressed with about me is that I've stayed current in the game. I've recognized as changes have taken place. You know, I'm not a spring chicken anymore out here, but you know, and so I've been in the game for over 30 years, coaching at this level, on and off. And so when you go back and you look at how the game was produced, and it's funny, the players of today, you know, if you talk to Tommy or Taylor or Alex Mickelson, I'm sure European guys, South Americans, the Asians are probably all the same. They see video from the 90s and they're like, oh my God, these guys were so bad. You know, like look how slow the game was. And it's kind of frustrating sometimes because you were there and you're watching the game, and the game was impressive. You know, the athleticism of the guys in that period. I think when you go back a little further, it does get slowed down, the way the game was produced a little bit. But the game is definitely faster. Tennis is a faster sport. It's a more physical sport now. I've tried to make adjustments in relationship to that. One of the things that we did this year, which I thought was Tommy's been dealing with some injuries. And so I've asked Franco, his strength and conditioning coach, to literally eliminate Tommy doing cardio training, like track work, and substitute that for time on a stationary bike or an assault bike or some other form of cardio where he can monitor Tommy's heart rate and know where he's at so that he's getting the development that he needs, but that he's not putting the pounding on his body, because I do think that the physicality of the game nowadays takes a greater toll on the athletes that are playing, on their body. And so if we as coaches can find a way to reduce that in what we're doing away from the tennis court, because obviously we're spending a lot of time training on court and then playing matches, and that's a pounding on the body. So way more of a pounding than it used to be, I think, you know. So that's a big change, I think, is trying to be aware of that. And I know that's just for our team. I'm not saying that everybody else is doing that or that they should or that whatever. Franco didn't love the idea. He really, but he feels, and I don't disagree with him to some, he feels that you dig down deep and find what a guy's really made of with those track workouts a lot of the time. I think you can do the same thing on an assault bike or a stationary bike or a Versa climber. But I mean, he's agreed. And we did the same thing with Ethan Quinn, who's obviously a much, much, much younger, I'd say much, much, much. He's 7 years younger than Tommy, 6 years younger than Tommy. And but Ethan's also already had, like, you know, some little issues with his knee and with a hip. And so we were like, you know, does it make sense? Even though he's younger, does it make sense to keep putting the pounding on the body right now? Like, let's alleviate that. Because one of my objectives with everybody I work with is to, you know, obviously we want to have the best results we can have week in and week out, but we also want to have longevity. We want to be able to make sure that the players have a long career and that they enjoy that aspect of it.
That's really, really interesting hearing you talking about a bit behind the scenes, because this is one of the things that I'm really excited about talking to you, Brad, which is like what the role of a coach is. And like from what you've been kind of describing, it sounds like almost like a team manager, like you would see a coach in a team sport type thing, or kind of a career manager in that sense, and sort of finding ways to help your player, in this case Tommy, develop. And there's a lot of, when people who aren't in the game or haven't been in this position kind of speculate on what the role of a coach is. It can be something like are you a technical director describing like what a player should or shouldn't do, or a tactical consultant where a player will talk to you about what they want to do and you tell them whether it's a good or bad idea, or feed different things in there. I don't know whether you do that as well, and maybe it's quite a multifaceted role, but it sounds to me like from speaking there, you kind of see what is your role as a coach. And
I think that you just hit it on the head. And if I had him here in front of me, Nick, I would put a hat on and then take it off, and then put a different hat on and then take it off, because that's part of what tennis coaching has always been. And that part hasn't necessarily changed either. And I think that I can only speak for our team, because I think different teams have different dynamics of who's in charge and who's making final decisions. The way I look at it always, and I say always, and that's not true. One of the things I was going to say is that from what you're saying, part of it depends on who you're coaching and at what point in their career they're at. So, for example, I started with Marty Fish when Marty was 18 years old and he was ranked about 360 in the world. That's a very different scenario than working with Sebastian Grosjean, who when I started with him was 28 years old, married, and had 2 kids. So he's a different human being in a different position in his life than Marty was at 18 years old. And so in working with Marty, I was much more of an authoritarian type of coaching situation. I'm telling him what to do. I'm telling him what time to be where. I'm telling him a lot of things. And I think that we've had that experience also with Ethan, with Brian Garber, who travels with Ethan, and we work together. And Brian's been, boots on the ground day to day. I feel like I'm kind of in the command center sending messages to Brian about what we want to do. And then we meet at certain places. But the first year and a half with Ethan was we're telling him everything. It's not a real collaboration, to be honest. It's us being in charge. When you work with someone like when I work with Sebastian, or now I've been with Tommy for 6 years, and I'd like to think that I'm smart enough to recognize that when I started with Tommy, he was outside the top 100. And Tommy was also still already a little bit older. So Tommy was 22 when I started with him. So it wasn't like he was a kid, but he also hadn't made top 100. So there was a little bit of a balance of, I'm telling you need to do this versus, hey, let's discuss this. And then as Tommy's matured and become more professional in how he approached everything, which probably, I would say it took a year and a half, maybe even a little bit longer before I would say Tommy was really a full professional, like making the right choices, making the right decisions on a regular basis, And I also say that when you want to make a change in your life, if you're a smoker, for example, or you're someone who doesn't get out and exercise very much, and you make a decision, man, I want to stop smoking. I want to start going to the gym on a regular basis. That becomes a day-to-day process. You have to say, okay, I'm not going to smoke today. You have to say, I'm getting myself to the gym today. Even if it's only for half an hour, I'm going to go to the gym. You have to do it on a day-to-day basis. So with Tommy, with Ethan, with everybody, there's a constant input of this is the right thing to do. Ultimately, he may not make that decision, but this is the right thing to do, and this is why. I'm a big believer from a coaching standpoint of explaining what it is that I'm asking them to do and why I think that's the best way to do it. And then as you work with more mature athletes, Tommy becomes 24, 25. Now he's in the top 20. Now he's like, he's out there on the tour. He's a veteran player now. Things become much more collaborative. And in the end, you want your player, I want my player anyway, to be the CEO of our company. I want him to have the final say. And what you said before, Nick, is very true, is that you become a little bit of a consultant. But I do want to be clear, I want to be really clear, that I see my role primarily as a tennis coach. So I'm coaching tennis. I'm coaching the technical aspects of tennis. I'm coaching the tactical aspects of tennis. That's my number one priority. But it's also my job because I am the head coach of our team. I think you talk to anybody in our team and they'll tell you that. And our team is basically, it's Tommy, it's Franco, it's Seba, and it's Hugo. So Hugo Armando is a coach that is based in Florida, and he works with Tommy when I'm not there. And we have constant communication about what Tommy's doing, what's going on. With Seba, what his role is as a physio. With Franco, what his role is as a strength and conditioning coach. And we've been really lucky in our team to all really mesh extremely well together. And then you can even add and include Brian and Ethan into that. They're almost a part of our team in a way because they have input sometimes about what's going on with things. So ultimately, yes, I manage all that, but I would take the most pride in what I do in saying we've made technical changes in Tommy's game. Tommy's forehand is way different than it was when we first started working together. Tommy didn't use a slice backhand virtually at all when we started. Now he uses a slice backhand very effectively and on a very regular basis. He didn't come forward. Now he comes forward and attacks a lot. Those are all tennis-related things that I'll take a lot of credit for, along with Tommy, obviously. So I need as a coach, one of the most important things that you want in your player is for them to be coachable. And Tommy's been extremely coachable. He's been extremely open to making adjustments, doing things a little bit differently, recognizing and accepting the vision that I've kind of created for him from when we started. And so to me, that's my first priority. And then after that, man, I know Brian is, I'm not as much. Brian's a travel agent. He does all the travel for Ethan. He sets it up for him. We're psychologists. If anyone's out there listening to this, I'd like to be in the commencement at Harvard and have someone give me an honorary, psychology degree, because I've been doing this for 33 years with professional tennis players and, individual athletes, I think more than any other athletes. I could be wrong. I've never coached another team sport, but I think individual athletes, the psychological aspects of being on the court are so significant. We talk about it. You guys talk about it, I'm sure, all the time. Yeah. Man, the margins of ball striking between, the very top players and a guy who's ranked 40 or 60 or 80 or sometimes even 150 or 200 is very small. The average tennis fan could go to a tournament and you could see a qualifier that's ranked, 280 in the world practicing on court with a guy who's ranked 20 in the world. And if you didn't know those players, if you're not a massive fan, you wouldn't be able to tell which one's which until all of a sudden they start playing points and there's pressure. And that's all the psychological aspects of it. So you're a psychologist. I'm lucky enough from my standpoint, I have a background. My college education was in kinesiology, exercise physiology. So I have a pretty good understanding of that. So when there's a physio-related thing, I would like to think that I have a decent amount of knowledge and input in relationship to that. Also, just being around the game as long as I've been around the game. Seba and I'll ask Seba questions. I give Seba a tiny bit of input, from my standpoint. And I say that because he's great at what he does, and I'm not a physio. Franco has been absolutely phenomenal. Because when we started with Franco's philosophy about movement and footwork on the tennis court was a little bit different than mine. And he was extremely open to how do you want me doing it? What do you want me teaching, Tommy? Because I want what I'm teaching on the court to be reflected in what he's doing off the court so that we're working symbiotically with what's happening so that that's helping develop Tommy. And I think that Tommy's development as a player, a lot of it has been massively helped by what Franco's done, in the gym in relationship to movement and things that I wanted him to do. So, yeah, so there's a lot of different hats. I'm probably missing a couple, in there that we just put on. And on top of that, Nick, I'll tell you that when you travel the amount that we travel with a player, I'm still doing this on a very full-time basis, 30, 35 weeks a year that I'm on the road with Tommy, and we see each other every single day. You need both as a player and a coach to have a very good view of these. When am I coaching? When are we being friends? And when does that change? Because it can change like that. So, because for me, we might be having a discussion about whatever, anything, has nothing to do with tennis. But something comes up and all of a sudden you're in coaching mode. And you're like, you see how this relates to what we were talking about how you're trying to play or what you're trying to do. It's the same thing. And so you're just constantly, I think we as coaches, maybe it's a fault if you talk to, spouses or girlfriends or boyfriends or kids or whatever. Maybe we're always coaching, we're always trying to get people to improve or do this or do that. So, man, there's a lot to it. There's a lot to it for sure.
That actually brings me to my next question, because just what you said there, how you're almost like a traveling circus a bit, and you've mentioned sort of the different players that you coach. How do you build trust with a player where, like you said, at different levels, you're coaching anyone from an 18-year-old where you have to like literally tell them what to do to maybe someone a little older where it's more of a conversation, or you're in such close circles, like when do you know where it's coaching and, oh, we're just having a conversation? How do you build that trust with a player, especially when you're just starting out, sort of if you're a new coach and you're trying to start out with a new player? What is that process?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing in relationship to that is the fact that, especially at the tour level, even at the collegiate level, I feel like, but especially at the tour level, I mean, obviously we're dealing with players that are the best players in the world. They know a lot about the sport already. They know what's been successful for them to get them to where they're at. Now they've hired you as a coach to try and help them. I think the bottom line is that the vast majority of players can kind of sift through the BS if what you're espousing in the information that you're giving out is coming across to them and they're going, what is he talking about? Like that just doesn't make any sense to me. I'm not going to be able to do that, or that's not the way I want to play, or, whatever it is. I think they kind of figure that out relatively quickly. And that's where you see relationships not work out. I think the second factor in relationship to that, Anastasia, is some coaches not being very good at recognizing at what stage a player is in their development as a human being as well as a tennis player. I think some coaches have a more of an authoritarian type of approach regardless of the age of the player. And so maybe players like that. Maybe they like being told what to do. But I think at some point you want to give, and again, this is my personal opinion and it's my approach to how I do things. But I would have said the same thing in raising my kids. I have 3 adults now. I don't have any kids anymore. I actually have 3 adults. But when they were little, my wife and I, we agreed that our job as parents was to make our kids be independent. And that's the way I view my role as a coach. I ultimately want to make my player be independent. I want them to be able to make the right decision in a snap situation on the court. I used to say this a lot in the past before we were allowed to coach on the court. Now it's a little bit different maybe, but I used to say, ultimately, I want to make my job obsolete. I want to make them not need me. And as much as you try to do that, I don't think it ever happens. But I also think that in my experience, the more we're the players and give them that sense, the more they actually want to have you around because they respect and listen to what you say because you're not forcing it on them. So I'm someone who asks a lot of questions. I formulate things that I want to present to my players in question form a lot because I want them to have to process it and come up with an answer that makes sense to them in their own head, not me telling them exactly how they do it. That always creates conversation. And I think conversation and dialogue is one of the most important ways that you can possibly coach and get information across to your players. I think a lot of coaches would tell you that some of the best coaching that you ever do is away from the tennis court, over lunch or dinner or breakfast or whatever, when the player's a little bit more open. They're maybe not, irritated or frustrated with how they're hitting the ball at the moment. So all of those things become factors. And I think that honesty ultimately is a key. Look, you're in a relationship with your player, and the keys to any relationship are really good communication and honesty. And I think, again, players are smart enough to be able to recognize and understand those things and know when you're being honest and when you're not being honest. And I think sometimes that you have to be, I think my reputation has always been that I can be brutally honest. I try to be brutally honest. How you frame that sometimes is really, really important. The words that you use and the presentation of that. I learned a long, long time ago when I was coaching college tennis that you don't have to scream and yell at players to get a point across. You can be stern and let them know that you're serious, but you don't have to scream and yell. I was a bit of a yeller when I first started in college coaching, probably because I was so young. I was trying to make sure that I was commanding respect from the players. Some of my players were 2 years younger than me. So yeah, I think that presentation is super important. I think one of the things that I know, Anastasia, that you did one of these with Brian Garber. And I think that if you spoke to Brian, I think one of the things that he would say is that both he and I, partly through, Brian's makeup is like this also. I think we're similar in a lot of ways, but we've been brutally honest with Ethan since he started on tour. And sometimes that hasn't been easy. Sometimes it hasn't been easy for us. Sometimes it hasn't been easy for him. But he's been great about knowing that we always have his best interest at heart when we're doing that or feeling the need to do that. And so I think in the end, that's just grown the respect that we all have for each other.
It's interesting talking about kind of coaching. Now, I know you mentioned a bit sort of how coaching is now with, you know, now it's mic'd up and, you know, coaches are a bit more visible and in the spotlight. Teams are bigger. Do you think that has helped coaching, or like, has it helped coaching, or do you think it's hurting? I don't know how you feel about what currently is happening now. I know some people are all for the coaching and some are not. How do you feel about where it's going right now?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. You just, a few minutes ago, I made myself think, you know, when you asked me the first question about what, you know, like way back about some of the differences between coaching in the 90s and coaching now, the most obvious one should have been, well, we can coach now. You know, we're allowed to coach. I mean, I think that coaching has always gone on to some degree or another, you know, but it was obviously not allowed. Now we're allowed to coach, and that's definitely created a little bit of a different dynamic in what we can do. It took Tommy and I a couple tournaments to kind of settle into that and make it. I would say at the beginning, he started using it as a means to kind of vent towards us or at us in the box, which he'd never done before, never really had done that. But all of a sudden it's like, oh, I can say whatever I want to the box now. And instead of using it as a positive way to kind of get, you know, critical information that can help you play better tennis, it was more him like verbalizing the things that were going on, you know, that he was irritated about on the court. And we needed to sit down, and we did have a conversation about that and said, like, look, that's not the goal of this, you know? And so we came to a conclusion that you know, Tommy, he didn't need to look at me or engage with me to be able to absorb coaching. You just need to be listening and paying attention to what's going on. So that was a big change for sure. And then I think that there's been a push, which I think's good. Like obviously for us within our profession, the ATP has actually even made a push to try and make coaches be a little bit more visible in what's going on. So now with the coaching that's allowed, there's a little more visibility throughout the matches, cameras pan to the coaches on the sideline. You know, there is a little bit of, we've had a lot of discussions within our coaches meetings with the ATP Coaches Association about being mic'd, not being mic'd from the standpoint, if I'm wearing a mic and I agree before the match to wear a mic, that's one thing. But a lot of time there's a live mic that's just right in front of us. And I don't like that. I think the vast majority of the coaches don't like that. You don't have that in other sports unless, you know, there might be a mic that picks something up here and there, but there's not a mic that's literally right on the coach throughout a football game or a, you know, US based soccer game or a you know, NBA game or something like that. And I don't think coaches would want that. You know, there's been matches where you're very aware of what's going on if you have a mic right in front of you, and you probably coach a little bit differently than if you didn't have one. I'm not one to.
I was just going to say, what did you think of? Because I remember seeing this, and I think it was the French Open in Roland Garros where Ben Shelton's coach, so his dad, was mic'd by the network, by TNT, and he communicated with the sort of the commentators during the match. I think he was playing with Carlos Alcaraz, and it was like play by play, like actually communicating. So that was even a level up from just having a mic there, listening to what he was saying. He was almost participating.
I did that as well. Anastasia, both at the French when Tommy played Carlos.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I was on that. I had a headpiece and was mic'd up. It wasn't on all the time, but I was communicating with John and Patrick McEnroe. They would come basically at the end of a set and come in. You could also listen. You could choose to listen to them or not listen to them throughout the match. And then at the U.S. Open, the coverage at U.S. Open took that to a whole nother level. Again, where we were doing that, I was interviewed 2 or 3 times during match play. And actually, I talked to Tommy after the match with Nuno Borges, and asked him if he was aware that I was being interviewed during the match and if he was comfortable with that. And he said, I didn't even know, like I wasn't aware at all. And I was like, okay, then that's fine. Because I wanted to make sure that he wasn't looking up and seeing me like, talking on the mic or whatever and going like, what's Brad doing? He's not paying attention to the match or whatever. So I wanted to make sure he was clear and okay with that. I do think that I don't mind that. I don't mind that they come to us at the end of a set. Whether I won the set or, Tommy's getting his butt kicked at the French by Carlos. And I'm mic'd up and they're asking me questions. And, at one point, Johnny Mac was like, do you think he should just stop? And I'm like, what kind of a question is that? I don't know. He's obviously, and his point was, that Tommy's obviously a little bit hampered. He's not at full output for the match. So should he stop? He's getting his butt kicked. So that was kind of like different. And at US Open, 2-3 times during the match, and a couple times I think I was on air for like at least a minute, which anyone that's been involved in TV knows is a pretty long time. I think that creates great exposure for us as coaches. And so I think there's a point to that. I think that from a fan standpoint, the fans are interested by that. And I think that we should be doing more and more and more within our sport to engage fans and draw more people in. And if it helps that I'm on camera at the end of a set or in the middle of a set where there's a break and it makes sense for it, if someone is on an injury timeout and you have a headpiece you're already wearing, and they come to you and say, hey, can we talk to you for 30 seconds while this timeout is going on? I'm going to say yes, 100%. I think every other coach should do the same thing, to be honest with you, because I think that's good for our sport. And that, for me, that's always, we're always very concerned about, the players. We want the players to be happy. We want the players to do this and everything, and that's important, obviously. But the players are out there competing, and just like Tommy not knowing that I was on the mic, they're unaware of that. But if we create a better product for tennis fans and we draw more fans into the sport because of that, then I think that's extremely important. And we get more exposure for ourselves as coaches. And I think that's important also. One thing that I would really like to see all the tournaments do, ATP, Grand Slams, everybody, PTA, and I've suggested this, I've spoken to some people about it, but I think that at every event, that in the finals, when you come to do the presentation at the end for the trophies and everything, that the coaches should be brought down onto the court to stand with their player and be introduced, potentially be interviewed, but at least should be recognized on the court rather than being up in the stands where their players go, I want to thank my team. They should be thanking their coach right there in front of them. And it always irritates me a little bit that the guy who's sitting in the umpire's chair that's calling the score gets some little memento of his having participated in the finals of the tournament, and the coaches are not very recognized. So that's something I think that they could do, and they've started to do it at a couple tournaments. I think they did do it at a couple tournaments.
Yeah. Nick, just before you jump in, because this is actually, I had this written in, and just because we're in a flow with it, because this has been a big thing that I've been wondering, especially as someone who, I watch a lot of American sports, like in basketball, you have coaching legends, really. You have, Belichick and Phil Jackson, and you know these coaches. And in tennis, it's kind of like, a few, very few who have coached, legends of the sport, but not really. Like if you ask someone on the streets, like, who's Novak Djokovic's coach, or who's, Rafa Nadal's coach, those players, but I doubt a fan could name right away anyone who coached them. And what you're talking about here, it's kind of like, it's interesting to see that change is coming slowly, I guess, and we're kind of seeing tennis kind of transition to almost what team sports have been doing before, where other team sport coaches or managers who are almost as known as their players. Now tennis is moving in that direction.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept when you look at team sports. I was never a pro tennis player. I played collegiately. That's common in other sports. In our sport, it's much more common that players seek out former players a lot of who have no coaching experience, not sure what their philosophies are from a coaching standpoint. So, but if you look at other sports, whether it's European football, American football, NBA, baseball, a lot of the most successful coaches are coaches that played at a lower level, never necessarily achieved great stardom. There are those that did, but there's a pathway in most of those team sports to becoming a head coach at the highest level. And we don't necessarily have that other than, and one of the problems that we've had in tennis, going back again to the 90s, and we still have it to this day, is that there's a real degree of unprofessionalness within the coaching ranks at times. And that's because we're an individual sport and you have, 500 or 1,000 or 2,000, if you want to go to the very bottom of the ranking list of, guys that have one ATP point, who do those guys take to a tournament to be their coach or their mentor or their support team? They take a buddy. They take some guy that's their exact same age that they played college tennis with. And they're like, hey, I'll pay your expenses if you'll come to Tunisia with me for 3 weeks for some futures. Even at the tour level with top 100 players, we get some people that are coaching that are questionable as to whether they're professional tennis coaches. And so that's always been an issue for us. Also, if you think about it historically, if you go back to the start of my coaching career on the tour, I started at 31 years of age. And at that time, really, I never even really thought about it back then. But I was really part of almost the second generation of coaches. The advent of players traveling and having a coach with them really started, I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, when you guys are tennis historians, but I think it started with Bjorn Borg, no? Leonard Berglund was really the first coach that traveled to tournaments ever, even if it was only Wimbledon or the French Open or a few of the events. I don't think anybody traveled full time back then. And then, 5 years down the road, all of a sudden you had a few of the top guys that had coaches that were maybe traveling on a more regular basis. And then by the time I came along, it had become more common where probably out of the top 100, I'd say 25%, maybe 30%, 40 at the very most had coaches. And the rest of the guys were either traveling on their own or traveling with a buddy for a week here or a week there or whatever. Or they had a coach that they worked with on a regular basis, but he didn't travel all the time, traveled to just the major tournaments. So I really started at a point where coaching started to become more of the norm. The vast majority of players. This was one of the issues we had back in the 90s. There was a coaching experiment that was done by the ATP. And part of the argument against it was that, well, a lot of the players don't have coaches. So now we're going to have some guy designating his girlfriend or his mom or his brother who's never played tennis in his life to be their coach and be sitting on the court. And that doesn't make a professional presentation. And so we've dealt with all of that stuff from a tennis standpoint, from a coaching standpoint, to garner more respect for what it is that we do. And Anastasia, you're exactly right from the standpoint. I kind of disagree. I think that if you went back, people that are real tennis fans would know who, like when he was playing, they knew who Stefan Edberg's coach was. They knew who Lendel's coach was. They knew, but only the guys at the top of the game. And that's not entirely different now. If you asked most tennis fans who Ethan Quinn is, they would probably know that he's a young American tennis player that's cracked the top 100 and is doing pretty well. They don't know exactly where he is or that kind of stuff. But if you asked who his coach was, I mean, unless people know Brian, they're not going to know Brian. And it's the same with, who coaches Shevchenko. Like Ethan played him at the French Open. And he had a team with him. I think he had 2 guys with him, maybe a strength and conditioning coach and a coach. I didn't know his coach. Like, I'm sorry if he's watching. And I feel like that's bad because I should know that. He's one of my peers. And despite the fact that my career may have been more notable in some ways than his career, I feel like we're peers. That's what we are. We do the same job. And he's trying to make his player as good as he can be, and I'm trying to make my player as good as I can be. And so I think that we have to continue to push and press for more professionalism within our sport. I think that the ATP could take a big role in that, in creating standards of, like, do you have to pass a test? I don't know. Do you have to like do a presentation on court to, 5 other coaches who've been in the game for more than 20 years or something? Maybe. So that we don't have this scenario where the camera pans to one of the boxes and you have someone in that box, whoever it might be, that just doesn't look or present or feel very professional. It's not like Saquon Barkley is going to the sidelines during a game and talking to his mom about how he should be, making the cut to try and get to the end zone. And that's an issue that we've had and we have still to this day.
I think that's interesting what you're saying there, and that goes back to your answer to the previous question Anastasia put forward, that obviously the increased visibility of coaching and your idea of having coaches on the court as part of presentations should be a reflection of that increased visibility, of the increased roles of coach over the last few decades, which is really, really interesting insight that you've given there. I guess my question would be, obviously, great visibility reflects the role that you play in developing your player, and that's the most important thing in there, and you're right, it should be done well. But again, a lot of people who are coming to tennis are coming from watching team sports, because there's not many other individual sports out there. Yeah. And so I guess my question to you is, if we do have this increased visibility of the coach in tennis, as kind of you're suggesting, but as the trend seems to be following in that direction, I think a conversation would probably need to be had about who's ultimately responsible for performance and results, because in a team sport, it is the coach a lot of the time, or is held responsible by the media and by the fans. And I was wondering is there a possibility that then the discourse around tennis, or the perception of tennis, might end up being the coach ends up being ultimately responsible for the players' results?
Yeah, which, we are to some degree, right? We should be. If we're doing what we're supposed to be doing in training and preparation. And, it's historically, before we had this, the change where coaching is allowed, tennis coaching was a job of preparation. We weren't allowed to coach during the matches. So it was a job of preparation. How do I prepare my player to be ready as he possibly can to compete at the best level that he possibly can for this particular match? And then do that again for the next match if he wins that one, and for the next match, or for the next tournament. And so it was fully and completely a job of preparation. Now it's a job of preparation, but I have the ability to make adjustments within the match. And so that creates more responsibility for me, and I want that responsibility personally. If I can have a positive outcome on the match, if I can create a scenario where I can help my player produce and play better tennis and compete better than what he might have if he was there completely and totally on his own, then I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. I think that what you're saying also, Nick, and one of the things that I think would create a lot more exposure for coaches, and I think that it should happen, to be honest with you, is that in the post-match interviews, post-match pressers that we have all the time, players are required to do, that coaches should do those as well. They should either come with their player, they should either do them together in conjunction with each other, or there should be a press conference for the player and a press conference for the coach. So to me, again, that creates a lot more exposure for the coach. I think it makes us have to be a lot more professional. We have to think about our responses and our answers. I mean, you're going to see a lot more personality of the coaches in those environments, because maybe after a win or a loss, you should have to do the presser either way, just like the players do, So I would be interested, personally. I would be interested to see Sasha's dad, have to do a post-match interview after he loses in the finals of a slam, or after he loses in the quarters of a slam, or after he loses in the second round of a Masters 1000, and maybe he's going to be pissed, look, we see in team sports all the time, right? Coach comes in and he throwing profanities left and right, and he's just pissed off about the loss, and he's taking it out on the press. And so you'd see a lot more personality, I think, of the coaches and what's going on. And I think that's another way that also, I think one of the things that happens for our coaches and for our sport is that I get way too much attention. Darren Cahill gets way too much attention. And I say that in a positive way because I would like to think that I'm a relatively articulate person that comes across well and does a good presentation on these type of things. And Darren does the same thing. I can name a bunch of other people that do the same thing. But it's not fair that I get asked to do this quite a lot in comparison to Brian Garber. I'm just using Brian as an example, but name the coach of, like I said, Shevchenko or 20 other guys that are ranked somewhere between 60 and 100. And like you're saying, let's get those guys more exposure. I want those guys to get more exposure. I want them to be recognized for the time and the effort and the work that they put in to trying to make their players better. But in our sport, because we have 100 guys instead of 16 teams or instead of 32 teams, the coaches get lost in the shuffle. Who's coaching the 75th ranked player in the world right now? I don't know exactly who the 75th ranked player in the world is, but I may or may not know their coach, because of what, and also we have turnover as people come into the game. I'll give you a perfect example. When Lerner Tien broke through and went from being 350 to 90 or 93, he brought with him his developmental coach, who they've split now, but he brought Eric Diaz along with him. Eric, someone that I do happen to know, and I think that so now all of a sudden you have a new coach. You have a new coach that's on the tour. He's just appeared out of nowhere. So it's like he didn't appear out of nowhere. He's been working with Lerner for who knows how long, but all of a sudden now he's a tour coach because he's sitting in the box at Australian Open or the French Open or Indian Wells, and so that's a process that from a coaching standpoint we have to deal with also. And it's and that's part of the situation also. Eric Diaz is a very professional coach. He runs an academy. He's done this for quite a while for a relatively young guy. He's been really successful. And yet at the same time, you might have somebody else that makes that same jump and they do it with a coach that's a little bit less professional. It's a little bit less of a professional situation from what you think. And all of a sudden, now they're a tour coach. And I think that's one of the things that holds us back also, and that it's always been this way. I've always said this, that coaches at the top of the game, if you're coaching a top 10 player, if you're coaching a Grand Slam champion, it's 100% for sure. But you get a lot of exposure and a lot of attention. And you're lucky enough to get sponsorship deals and you make money from those things. Now so way more than you did back in the 90s. But there's a lot of great coaches that go basically unnoticed doing their jobs, and they do a great job because their player never maybe gets past 65 in the world. But getting that player to 65 in the world was an amazing job because maybe that guy massively overachieved to get to 65. When he was 250, people were saying that guy will never make top 100. And you got him to 65. That's a great coaching job. But that guy doesn't get much exposure or attention or credit for that. And that's just the nature of our sport. And that's what you're saying. From a team sport standpoint, you could be the worst team in the league and coach is still known. He might be vilified for being the worst team in the league, but
I know him.
Yeah, and he might get fired. But, you know who he is, and a year later he's probably back in the game coaching with, a top 10 team in the league or maybe a top 5 or a top 2 team in the league, So tennis is tough. Without you guys asking a question, it's funny because from my standpoint, when I started in the game, I'm coming out of collegiate tennis, and I'm a little nervous for sure going into coaching at the tour level. And my goal when I got into pro coaching at the professional tour level was, man, I want to stay here for 10 years. I want to be in the game for 10 years. I don't want to be a flash in the pan. I don't want to get into the game and be here for a year and a half and then be gone. And no one ever remembers my name or knows who I was, because maybe I didn't do a very good job, or for whatever reason, I just wasn't able to stay in the game as long as I wanted to. I've been super lucky, obviously. Courier's my first full-time gig on the tour, and I'm being mentored by Jose Higueras, who, in my opinion, to this day is one of the most special, just amazing tactical, technical minds in our sport. And here I am, my first gig in tennis, and I get to be educated and mentored by that guy, and that was super lucky. And then Jim wins 4 Grand Slams and becomes number 1 in the world. I've been living off that ever since.
Well, let's look towards, the last section here, which is the future of tennis coaching. You've talked a little bit about that here already, but what do you think, I think we created this series, Meet the Professional, because, saw, a lot of people online, they're always like, oh, I want to work in tennis, I want to do this or whatever, but there's usually no sort of pathway, road for them to take. So it was nice to sort of talk to professionals in tennis who are not tennis players. But what do you think the next generation of coaches, what do they need to succeed? Because like you said earlier on in this, at least for now, there's no test, there's no school to go to say, I want to be an ATP WTA coach. So what do you think the next generation of coaches need to do?
I think that honestly, the path that I ended up taking is still the path that you take. It's not my exact path by any means, but I think that, especially if you weren't a player, that's the thing that's different. If you were a player really at any decent level as a tour level player, if you were top 250, 300, 400, whatever, you played a few qualifyings of some tour events or whatever, there's a respect that's given to that. If you were a really good player, then there's an instantaneous respect that's given to that. That's something that in some ways, especially when I was younger, and to this day to some degree, I've always had a little chip on my shoulder, which I think is maybe one of the reasons that I've done well in the game, because I wasn't a player. And I'm more than happy to say that all the time. I was never a tour level player. Not sure that I was ever good enough to be a tour level player by any means. And so it's tour level players have an into the coaching aspect of our sport that is automatic. And sometimes I think that's unfair, because I don't think that every guy that's played on the tour necessarily makes a great coach. We certainly had some, when you look at Juan Carlos with Alcaraz right now, and the guy that always pops into my head now, he just popped out of my head, but is who coached Stine for the longest time, Swedish player that got to 2 in the world.
Magnus Norman. I think he's such an intelligent, well-rounded coach, and I think that he, their whole group, they have other coaches that are working with them from their academy, and I think they've done a phenomenal job. Don't mean to be giving them a plug necessarily, but I think that there's guys like that have been really good players that make really, really good coaches. There's a lot of others that over my 33 years on the tour, I've seen guys that have come out that were really good players, and they just weren't very good coaches. They couldn't translate what worked for them or how they competed or what they did in a way that helped players get better. So from my standpoint, as a non-player, a collegiate level player, I think that ultimately you have to start at the junior level. You have to develop yourself at the junior level. And something that I've always said, I've said it on a number of other podcasts, is that I think that one of the skill sets that you should have as a coach, regardless of whether you were a player or not, you should have the ability to take the information that you want to present to a professional tennis player, and you should be able to present that to a 10-year-old that's never been on the court before, or to a ladies 3-0 player that's 40 years old. And you should be able to present that in a simplistic method that allows that 10-year-old or that lady to understand what it is you're presenting to them in the concepts. Are they going to be able to do it instantaneously like a pro level player or a college level player or a high level junior? No, obviously not. But will they be able to understand it and comprehend it and then try and work towards it?
you should be able to present that in that manner. And I think you gain that by working with juniors. I think putting yourself in a position where you're working with, 10, 12, 14, 15-year-old kids at all different levels of the game. And then that leads you potentially to now traveling and doing some work with a junior player, either on a national basis, or ITFs are such a big part of what goes on in junior tennis now. Wasn't back when I was, coaching initially. But that gets you exposure to coaching. That type of coaching tends to be, again, like we went back to, a little more authoritarian. You're working with a junior. But taking the responsibility for being on the road with a 16-year-old and making sure that they're getting to their practices, that they're eating what they're supposed to be eating, that they're going to bed, that they're doing all that stuff, that's an education for you as a coach. And that then translates to, like, okay, if you do a really good job with that kid and he's playing at that level where he's traveling and playing some international events, whether you're based in Europe or you're here in the States or you're in South America or whatever, you have those kids that are going to be around playing those type of events. Whether you take them for a 2-hour drive and spend 3 nights there, or whether you fly, to a different continent, you're getting a lot of experience in managing. Back to what we talked about before, Nick, is not just the coaching. It's like, I'm teaching him how to hit a backhand and a forehand and a serve and all that, but I'm also learning how to manage all the rest of that stuff that's part of coaching. That's actually part of our job as coaches. So to me, that's the pathway that you take. And then if you do a good job with that kid, anytime you do a good job, the greatest advertisement that you get is word of mouth. That kid's parents talk to other parents. Hey, this guy took our kid to South America for 3 weeks, and it was an amazing experience for him. He came back and he was a better tennis player than he was before. He was a more mature kid than he was before. He's telling me, Mom, I need to be eating this for breakfast because I want to have the right kind of energy. And you learn that from the coach, hopefully. Also exposing yourself. I did a lot of this when I was younger, exposing yourself to coaching conferences, listening to speakers. Now we get the advantage of having podcasts and those kind of things where you can listen to people. I think you have to be careful about who you listen to and who you don't. You have to be smart enough to pick and choose what makes sense to you, what doesn't make sense to you. But I think that's the pathway. And you develop a reputation, again, if you do a good job. If you don't do a good job, you're going to know it because those people aren't going to ask you to go on a trip again. And then you have to examine yourself and say, okay, how come I didn't get invited to take him to another, 3-week trip? Well, because you were a lazy sack and you didn't do anything, or because you went out one night and the kid snuck out of his room and was out until 1:00 in the morning and his parents found out. That's the kind of stuff that you find out about. And then you develop with that player. And if you do a good job with that and you're at an academy or you're somewhere else, you're going to get bumped up. Hey, you did a great job with this kid. Now we have an even better player. We want you to take him. And that puts you in a position where you go from that kid to a kid who's playing futures, or a kid who wins, or at least competes at the Grand Slam level in the juniors. And that's a progression. I've known a few guys that have tried to skip those progressions and have just been like, hey, I want to be a tour coach. Well, where's your credentials? How do you deserve to be a tour coach? And there's one guy that comes to my mind, that thought he was just going to jump into being a tour coach somehow. And myself and a couple other people told him that's not how it works. You're not just going to just all of a sudden be coaching a guy that's a top 100 or a top 130 player out of the blue. They're not going to want to hire you because you have no background. So you have to put your time in. And if you think about that, like I've said his name a few times, but Anastasia, this with Brian. That's exactly how Brian, Brian much younger. Brian's kind of he's a little bit past where the start of my career was. And he, I think he's on a great path with Ethan. I think Ethan's a great player for Brian to be with. I've taken on the role of being his Jose a little bit. I don't put myself in the same category as Jose, but I think that, I've been able to mentor Brian and help him along in some ways. And I think we've been lucky from that standpoint. I think I was so lucky from that standpoint. And I think that's something that if you're a young coach, you have to seek out those kind of people to at least, maybe they're not officially part of your team, but you have to have those kind of people around that you can rely on, that you can reach out to, and they can mentor you. I look back, I've had 4 great mentors in my coaching career, and they all came along at the right times in my career for some reason. One was my junior college coach, a guy named Rich Anderson, who I learned so much from him about the technical aspects of the game. He was a great technician at teaching the game. And there's things I use to this day about how to hit the ball and the mechanics of hitting the ball that I learned from him back in the early 80s. And then I was exposed to Greg Patton. And I really learned from Greg that you just didn't give in on the moral, ethical, integrity aspects of what you demanded from a player, and that character mattered. Those things were all character. I don't think Greg was the greatest technical or tactical coach in the world, but he was a phenomenal, amazing motivator. He created an environment where players got better all the time, and he held them to a standard that was incredibly high. And that always stuck with me in my mind. And I think coaching character is so important, and that was a big aspect for me. And then Tom Gullickson came along for me, and Tom made me recognize and understand so much more tactically about the game, and also that you needed to make it fun. You needed to create an environment for the players where it was enjoyable and entertaining for them while you were still competing. And then the cherry on the top for me was Jose Higueras, who was just, he's just another level in my mind. And I got to be around that and see his presentation with Jim and with other players, and how he trained them on a regular basis and everything. And so all of those things led to me being the coach that I became, and they're all, I look at those 4 guys to this day, and those 4 guys just, they helped me so much at the different times in my career.
Really, I think it's really cool. I think you've kind of covered a lot of it. That's really, really helpful advice for anyone who's looking to go in. Like, don't just jump to tour level, work your way through, go and coach a youngster. And I think that's where a lot of the people who aren't coaches, haven't been players, I should say, haven't been players, have kind of come in. And that's where you're kind of like, oh, they got this kid to this point, and then they kind of get themselves on the radar. We'll probably see Learn Etienne's coach on the tour again at some point, gets picked up by someone else, because let's face it, he got Learn Etienne to this breakthrough. I guess this is probably a bit of a tangent based on what you're going on, but this is really interesting to me. But would you give any different advice to anyone wanted to coach, depending on whether they wanted to go onto the ATP or WTA tours? Because we mentioned a lot of the guys today, and I'm more known on the podcast for I tend to watch slightly more WTA than ATP, but I was wondering whether these coaching ideas are kind of universal, doesn't really matter, or whether you would need to consider different things.
Yeah, I think, I spent a very brief amount of time with Jenny Brady while she was struggling a little bit with her plantar fasciitis. That was while I was coaching Tommy. She approached me, and Tommy was like, yeah, it's fine, no problem. And I always thought it was funny, because I used to say that Jenny was the Tommy Paul of the women's tour. She was just super chill and laid back, and super talented. And so I spent some time with her, went to a few terms, but other than that, I've never coached on the women's tour. So I think the women are a little bit different. I mean, women are different. Anastasia, agreed? The book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. We communicate a little bit differently. We hear things a little bit differently. I mean, I would say that if I was going to go coach full-time on the women's tour, I think that, I might go read that book, for example, and think about your presentation towards a female athlete is probably a little bit different. You could say the exact same words in the exact same tone that you said to a male player, and they might be received differently, perceived a little bit differently. And I think you have to understand that, that if you're going to be on the women's tour, obviously coaches that have been extremely successful on the women's tour, they must understand that to some degree. They must also understand, I think, that, just because you're working with a woman doesn't mean that they're fragile or that you're going to break them. You have to be tough on them, just like you are with a male athlete. I think that's why they're where they are, because they've been successful, and been able to push through a lot of things. But yeah, I would imagine that it's different. So you have to maybe understand that and spend a little bit of time. It's the same thing, if you get out there and you are on the women's tour more, and I think it goes back to what I was saying before. If you take that whole scenario I talked about before, and now you make that player be a 12-year-old girl, a 14-year-old girl, a 15-year-old girl, that's a different scenario. And the girls are different also. I mean, if you're going on the road with a 15-year-old girl, 99.9% chance that you're going with a mom or a dad, because they're not going to if you're a male coach, and especially if you're 22 years old and you're traveling with a girl who's 15 years old, I'm sorry, I'm not sending you alone with my daughter. So someone's going to go in that scenario. But I mean, if you're working with junior players that are girls, which I have been around more of, then I mean, that's a whole different scenario. They haven't necessarily achieved that point where they get to being a pro player. Doesn't mean, again, that you don't necessarily have to be hard and honest with them at times. But I think there's definitely a tendency for a different presentation. My firstborn is a daughter, and I love the fact that I had a daughter first, because I think it made me a little bit more genteel in my parenting, was having a girl first. That I think it made me like that with my boys, which was good, But I know that my conversations and how my daughter has dealt with difficult scenarios in her life over the last, 33 years is definitely different than how my boys do. And so, and that's just the nature of, the physiology and the mental aspects of guys and girls. And if you're not aware of that as a coach, I think you're making a mistake. You have to understand that for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so we have come to the end of this awesome conversation, but I want to end on some quick fire questions just to wrap everything up, because this has been so awesome. Quick fire questions. What is your favorite tournament to coach at?
Oh, that's super easy. If you eliminated the 4 slams, it would be much tougher. But if you include the slams, for me, Wimbledon is I call it the Vatican of tennis. It's the history of our sport. Going to Wimbledon is the best by far.
I'd agree.
Nick is going to be happy. What do you think the most underrated part of your job is?
The most underrated part. That's a tough question. Gosh, I think it's both the most overrated and the most underrated, probably in some ways, is the travel. The travel can be brutal, but it can also be phenomenal. The places that we get to go to, and if you take the time to explore places, and I'm someone who loves to expose yourself to different cultures and different food and all that kind of stuff. So the travel for me is great. It gets overrated. Oh, look at all the spectacular places here, and you're like, yeah, I've been on the road for 6 weeks right now. I'm just ready to get home.
Okay, and this one I'm really fascinated. So take Tommy out of the picture just for a week. You could coach anyone in the world for a week, male or female player. Who would it be? For a week.
Can I take the second week of a Grand Slam and say that if it's the 1 week that's the second week of a Grand Slam, I'm taking either Yannick or Carlos, one of those two guys. So it's funny that you say that. I'm not going to say his name. But if you ask Brian, he'll know. I've said for a while that there's a guy on tour that if Tommy were injured or couldn't play for a while, there's a guy that I think I would really love to take on the challenge of coaching. I don't think it would be an easy challenge necessarily, but there is one player out there that I really, really would like to coach.
Oh, now I want to know.
I'll tell you off camera.
Okay, fine.
That being said, I don't want to, because you said this, that being said, I feel incredibly lucky to coach Tommy Paul. I think he's been, the 6 years that we've spent together, we haven't gotten stale in the least. Super excited for him to get healthy and get back playing, because I'm really excited to get back on court with him and keep doing the things that we've been doing. And he's just such a good guy, and he's fun to be with. He's a fun guy to spend time with, and at the same time, he's so committed and dedicated to wanting to be as good a player as he can be that, you know, like you said, 1 week, you know, if it was right now while Tommy's still rehabbing, you know, if someone called me and said, hey, would you do a week or two with me? I would do it probably. But
Yeah.
I can't wait for Tommy to get healthy and get back on court with him.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
I guess my last question is going back to our ethos as a podcast, whereas we kind of exist to help newer fans or more casual fans keep things a bit more kind of simple, well not simple, kind of easier to understand and kind of ease you in and guide you into the sport. And I guess I'd like to give you the opportunity to maybe address someone who's kind of listening or watching and is getting into the sport. What is it that you would most advise someone who is getting into watching the sport and becoming a fan to understand about the sport of tennis?
Man, to understand about the sport of tennis, you know, the first advice I would give them, Nick, is go to a tournament. Men's tournament, women's tournament, whatever it might be. It doesn't matter. You got to go see the sport live. You got to go see it live. It's like every other sport. I don't care, you know, like Tommy said he's not a soccer fan, you know, and I took him to his first soccer games and he loved it. You know, people say baseball's boring or whatever and stuff. Go to a live baseball game. It's a blast. It's an absolute blast. And you haven't experienced any sport, I don't think, until you've seen it live. So I would encourage anyone that's interested in tennis, even in the smallest amount, to make an effort to go to an event. Even, you know what? Go to a futures event. Go to a challenger. Go to a tour event. Whatever it is, men's or women's, you know, you don't have to go to a Grand Slam. Just find something that's as close to you as you can possibly get to and go experience live tennis at that level. It's an amazing thing. And then the other thing, you know, the only other thing that I would say, the first thing you have to learn is our crazy scorekeeping system. You know, it's like when you're a new fan and you're trying, you know, like as us that know the sport, if you talk to someone that's never been to a tennis match or never really watched a tennis match, but you know, you're taking them for the first time or whatever, and you're watching it on TV, and you try to explain the scoring system, it's not just the numbers. It's not the 15, 30, 40, you know, that part. It's, oh, you have to win by 2 points. And it's the first one to get to 6 games, but you have to win by 2 games. And then if you get to 7, they play a tiebreaker, and that's a completely different scoring system than the other scoring system. And it's like, it's crazy. You know, it actually is. But you know what? I've heard Billie Jean King and some other people talk about, like, we have to simplify the scoring system. Why don't we go to 1, 2, 3 or whatever and stuff, you know? And I actually don't like that. I think that we should maintain the history of our crazy scoring system, you know, but as a fan, you have to learn how to keep score, because otherwise you're watching the sport and you don't know what the heck is going on with the points. You're like, why are they still playing? Why? I thought he won that game. I thought this was going on here. So you have to learn how to keep score. That's the first thing. And then go to a tournament. Once you know how to keep score, then go to a tournament.
I just want to say, we in no way coached Brad Stine to say go to a tournament. Did not tell him to say that. That's just our thing. But what do we always say, Nick? Go to a tournament and just see the sport live.
Yeah.
Brad, this has been awesome. I learned so much. We could keep talking forever, but it was really great to have you on Ground Pass and talk all things coaching. And I hope all you Ground Passers listening have learned a little bit more about coaching. You know, I'm looking forward to the Australian Open, where they have the, you know, coaches sitting on the court. You know, I feel like if you're watching that coming up, you will understand better. Brad, I'm sure you're going to be mic'd up for the tournament, so it's going to be great. It's going to be awesome.
At some point here or there, for sure.
Yeah, totally. Nick, it's been awesome. It's been great. We will see you guys at a tournament sometime soon. Bye, guys.
Thanks, guys.